Why would a gorgeous lady be left unchaperoned? The Duke asked, and it changed her life. London in the season wore its splendor like armor, polished and unforgiving, and on that evening the chandeliers blazed as if determined to expose every flaw they illuminated. Carriages arrived in a measured procession, wheels hissing against damp stone, liveried footmen opening doors with rehearsed indifference. Inside the assembly rooms, silk whispered, jewels caught firelight, and manners ruled with the tyranny of habit. It was a place where virtue was assumed until proven otherwise, and where a woman's reputation could be weighed, found wanting, and discarded between one dance and the next. She entered alone. The young lady paused just beyond the threshold, gloved hands folded with deliberate care, spine held straight by a discipline learned early and tested often. Her gown was modest yet exquisite, cut with a quiet elegance that spoke of good breeding rather than abundance. Those who noticed her first remarked on her beauty, then on the absence beside her, and finally on the impropriety of that absence. A mother should have been there, or an aunt, or at the very least a companion paid to stand as witness. Instead there was only space, conspicuous and condemning. Whispers traveled faster than the music. They slid along the polished floor, rose with the warmth of candlelight, and settled into ears already inclined to judgment. Some wondered aloud whether misfortune had stripped her of protection. Others suggested, with softened voices and sharpened eyes, that the lack was intentional. She heard enough to know the verdict forming, and yet she did not retreat. Pride, fragile but stubborn, anchored her feet. She had come because she must, because survival demanded visibility, and because invisibility had already cost her too much. Her mother's death lay scarcely a year behind her, a loss that had hollowed their household and stripped it of its last unquestioned safeguard. Mourning had been proper, prolonged, and financially ruinous. Her father, once received with cautious respect, had withdrawn from society thereafter, wounded by grief and an old slight that had never healed. Invitations dwindled. Doors closed. When the season arrived, she faced a choice that was no choice at all: remain absent and fade entirely, or attend without the shield society required and risk censure in exchange for a chance. She chose the latter and now bore its weight. As she moved into the room, faces turned and turned away again, smiles tightening before dissolving. A matron's fan paused mid-flutter. A gentleman's bow faltered, recalibrated, and resumed with cool correctness. The orchestra struck a brighter tune, and couples assembled as if on command, leaving her at the edge of the floor, visible precisely because she was not included. She felt the heat in her cheeks and steadied her breath, reminding herself that composure was not the absence of fear but the refusal to be ruled by it. Across the room, the Duke observed. He stood apart from the press, a figure of composed authority whose presence altered the balance of any space he occupied. Years of command had trained his expression into reserve, yet his gaze was attentive, discerning the currents beneath the spectacle. He had arrived late, as was his habit, preferring to enter when the room had settled into its patterns. What caught his attention now was not a display of excess but a contradiction. A young woman evidently formed by careful upbringing, standing without protection in a setting that punished such exposure without mercy. He noted the details others missed. The steadiness of her posture under scrutiny. The restraint of her dress, neither courting notice nor inviting neglect. The faint tightening at the corner of her mouth when laughter reached her from behind, controlled and unacknowledged. This was not carelessness, he thought, but necessity masquerading as boldness. The distinction mattered. The whispers reached him as well, softened by distance but unmistakable in intent. He felt a familiar displeasure stir, the old impatience with a society that congratulated itself on virtue while devouring the vulnerable. Titles had taught him how easily power excused itself. Duty had taught him how rarely conscience was consulted. He remained still, weighing the moment, aware that any intervention would be read, interpreted, and misused. Silence, however, would be read the same. The young lady, sensing the room closing ranks against her, lifted her chin and took a step forward, as if to cross an invisible threshold and claim a place denied her. It was a small act, nearly imperceptible, yet it shifted something in him. He recognized the courage it required to advance when retreat would have been easier, safer, and more acceptable. The orchestra swelled. A laugh rang too loudly. The moment tightened, expectant and cruel. He moved. The path he took cut through the center of the room, unhurried and unmistakable. Conversations thinned and stilled as he passed, attention drawn by the certainty of his progress. When he stopped before her, the space around them cleared as if by instinct. She looked up, surprise briefly unguarded, then gathered herself, offering a courtesy precise and respectful. Her eyes met his with a calm that cost her dearly. His voice when he spoke carried without effort. It was neither raised nor softened, but measured to be heard. "Why?" he asked, allowing the word its full weight. "Would a gorgeous lady be left unchaperoned?" The question fell into the room like a challenge. It did not accuse her. It accused everyone else. A hush followed, thick with recalculation. The whispered judgments recoiled, uncertain of their footing. She felt the ground shift beneath her, confusion mingling with a fragile surge of relief. The Duke's gaze remained steady, offering no explanation, no apology, only the implicit assertion that her presence demanded respect. In that suspended instant, she understood that whatever followed would alter her course for better or worse. The season had found its story, and she stood at its heart, no longer unseen yet not yet safe. Hope stirred, cautious and bright, promising trials ahead, watched by judgment, destiny and desire. The silence his question created did not shatter at once. It fractured slowly, like ice giving way beneath careful steps. Faces shifted, fans resumed their motion with altered purpose, and glances darted between the Duke and the young woman now standing unmistakably within his notice. She felt the change before she understood it, as though the air itself had been rearranged around her. Where moments before she had been an object of speculation, she was now the axis upon which the room turned, protected not by explanation but by his unmistakable authority. He did not offer his arm immediately. Instead, he inclined his head with deliberate courtesy, allowing her a breath in which to choose dignity over astonishment. When she accepted, placing her gloved fingers lightly upon his sleeve, the gesture was restrained yet irrevocable. The contact drew a collective intake of breath from the assembly, for such proximity carried meaning in a world governed by implication. Together they crossed the floor, their pace measured, the orchestra adjusting instinctively as though recognizing a new command. Whispers resumed, altered in tone and direction. Speculation unfurled like smoke, reshaping itself around conjecture of motive and consequence. Some saw gallantry in his conduct, others ambition, and still others a calculated provocation designed to unsettle rivals. For her part, she felt only the steadying influence of his presence, the curious safety of being seen without being consumed. He spoke to her quietly, remarks confined to neutral pleasantries, yet each word was weighted with care, as if he understood how closely the room listened. The first token followed swiftly, though few recognized it as such. When the music ended, he did not release her at once but guided her toward a grouping near the dais, a place reserved for those beyond question. The matron stationed there hesitated, then inclined her head, recognizing the authority before her. By seating the young woman within that circle, the Duke placed her beyond casual censure, if not beyond curiosity. It was a gesture both simple and bold, and its implications traveled faster than any whispered rumor. She sensed the danger even as gratitude warmed her. Each kindness, publicly bestowed, sharpened scrutiny rather than softening it. Invitations followed, extended through intermediaries who watched her carefully for missteps. She accepted some, declined others, learning quickly that visibility required discernment. The Duke appeared often enough to confirm intent, yet rarely enough to invite speculation. When he spoke on her behalf, it was with precision, never overreaching, never diminishing her agency. Scandal, however, thrives on imbalance, and balance was shifting. A rumor surfaced suggesting that her family's decline was not merely unfortunate but deserved, tied to old disputes and contested inheritances best left undisturbed. The story grew in retelling, gathering embellishment and malice in equal measure. She heard fragments of it in passing, felt its chill in the coolness of certain beaux and the sudden restraint of former acquaintances. The Duke, informed through channels invisible to her, did not confront the gossip directly. Instead, he offered another token, quieter but no less potent. An invitation arrived bearing his seal, requesting her presence at a small gathering hosted under his auspices. The wording was impeccable, the tone unassailable. Attendance would imply endorsement, absence would invite interpretation. She accepted, understanding that refusal would undo what little ground she had gained. The evening passed without incident, yet its significance lay in who attended and who observed. Names carried weight and their presence spoke volumes. By morning, the rumor had altered again, weakened by proximity to those who would not associate lightly with disgrace. Still, suspicion lingered, seeking new ground. Questions arose regarding his interest, his purpose, and the cost of his attentions. Some suggested he played a dangerous game, others that she did. The Duke bore it with composure, but she began to sense the strain beneath his restraint. Their conversations, though brief and proper, acquired an undercurrent of urgency, as if time itself had become a participant. She wondered what price he paid for his interventions and whether she could justify it. The answer arrived unbidden in the form of confrontation. At a subsequent assembly, a gentleman of notable influence allowed his courtesy to lapse just enough to expose intent, questioning her status within careful bounds. Before she could respond, the Duke intervened, his tone calm yet unmistakably final. The exchange drew attention, crystallizing tensions long simmering. By defending her so openly, he transformed rumor into spectacle, forcing society to choose between retreat and escalation. As the evening waned, she stood once more beside him, aware that the protection he offered had become inseparable from peril. Gratitude deepened into something more complex, edged with concern and resolve. When he escorted her to her carriage, the street lamps casting long reflections across the wet stone, he paused, meeting her gaze with an intensity he had thus far restrained. Nothing improper was said, yet the silence carried promise and warning alike. She returned home knowing that the tokens bestowed upon her had altered her standing irrevocably. Scandal had not vanished, it had merely changed shape, circling closer, more determined. Yet she was no longer alone at its center. The Duke had bound his reputation to hers through deliberate choice, and in doing so, had drawn a line neither could easily withdraw from. As the carriage rolled away, she understood that protection, once given, demanded reckoning, and the story unfolding around them had only begun to reveal its cost. The rain had begun in a hesitant drizzle, soft enough to patter against the windows without obscuring the flickering light of the library's fire. She sat in the quiet, arms folded around herself, feeling the warmth of the room as both comfort and barrier. Outside, London streets were blurred into mist, the sounds of carriage wheels and distant laughter muted by the night. Within these walls, she dared to breathe differently, unobserved by the sharp eyes of society, yet watched in another way, by him. The Duke had remained in the room, not imposing, not speaking at first, simply allowing presence to settle like a gentle weight. There was an intimacy in shared silence that had been denied her all her life, and she recognized it immediately. She was being seen truly without the crowd's interference. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, the timbre low but steady, threading through the quiet like a tether to reality. "You bear more than you should," he said, the words neither a reproach nor a pitying observation. He simply stated what was obvious to both of them. She did not answer at once. Her hands tightened on her lap, gloved fingers pressing lightly into the fabric of her gown, as if to anchor herself against the turbulence of acknowledgement. That someone of his standing would perceive her burden without the necessity of explanation astonished her more than the whispered scandal ever had. It was not flattery, it was recognition. Her confession came in soft, measured tones, almost as if admitting aloud might fracture her entirely. "Since my mother's passing, the world has been less certain of my place," she said. "My father withdraws not from shame, but from grief that society neither recognizes nor forgives. And I," her voice faltered, brushing against the truth she had so carefully contained, "I must navigate the season alone, lest we vanish entirely from notice." She looked down as if the words might vanish into the hearth's fire. "I am grateful for your presence. I fear, though, the cost it brings to you." The admission hung between them, fragile and precise, a delicate balance of dignity and vulnerability. The Duke's gaze did not waver. He studied her as one might a rare manuscript, noting the courage etched into every measured movement, the quiet fortitude in her eyes, and the subtle hesitation of someone accustomed to measured restraint. "There is no cost I will not bear," he said, each word deliberate, "for the sake of truth and fairness. You will not suffer alone, not while it lies within my power to prevent it." His pronouncement was neither flamboyant nor theatrical, it carried gravity by virtue of its simplicity. There was no declaration of affection in that moment, yet every syllable was weighted with the beginnings of desire restrained by duty, by etiquette, by the rigid expectation of the world outside these walls. They spoke of practical matters next, as if mapping the terrain of both threat and protection. The inheritance that had long been contested by distant relatives, the old accusations leveled against her father's estate, the subtle power plays of neighbors who could neither ignore nor condone her visibility, each point was enumerated with care. She listened intently, realizing that his interest extended beyond propriety or the satisfaction of curiosity. He sought understanding, not entertainment, he sought action, not spectacle. And in his listening, she recognized the rare relief of being considered capable of thought, worthy of judgment beyond rumor. Yet beneath practicality lingered the unspoken. In every glance, every slight adjustment of posture, every deliberate pause, there was a conversation unmarked by words. Their hands remained distant, yet both sensed the proximity of touch, the near collision of glances, the accidental brush of sleeves as he adjusted a book or offered a seat. Each moment was charged with restraint, the sort of tension that society both permitted and punished in equal measure. She became acutely aware of her heartbeat, of the warmth suffusing her cheeks, of the strange and unwelcome stirring of hope that perhaps a man of his station could choose conscience over convention, choice over duty alone. He shifted, walking toward a small table stacked with documents and letters, the lamp casting a haloed glow over both of them. "I cannot pretend," he said, "that all who observe us will understand. There will be whispers, interpretations, and misjudgments. But within this room and in the spaces I can influence, you shall be afforded truth." He paused, letting the weight of responsibility settle upon both their shoulders. "I do not act from pity. I act from recognition of merit, of courage, and of honor long denied its due." His words were deliberate, and she understood the careful distinction. He did not save her because she was beautiful, but because she had endured, persevered, and revealed an integrity that demanded acknowledgement. A storm began outside, stronger now, drumming against the windows and echoing through the vaulted spaces of the library. The sound seemed to both shield and announce them, as if the world beyond these walls could not intrude while nature rehearsed its own intensity. She felt the comfort and the fear entwined. Comfort in his vigilance, fear in the knowledge that their lives remained entangled with public scrutiny, and that every act of protection required courage on his part as well. The realization deepened her gratitude and quietly something more delicate, a budding affection, tentative yet insistent, hidden beneath the surface of careful speech. Her voice returned in measured intervals, sharing fragments of her past, childhood routines governed by etiquette, her mother's lessons in discretion, the subtle strategies employed to navigate a world that rewarded beauty only when it accompanied wealth or power. She admitted, almost in passing, the loneliness that had shadowed her, the vigilance required to maintain composure, the exhaustion of always being judged while remaining unseen. Each admission was a step closer to unveiling not just circumstance, but self, a revelation met with patient attention rather than interruption, judgment, or condescension. He responded in kind, revealing just enough of his own restraint to mirror her disclosure. He spoke of expectations born of title, of alliances that constrained personal inclination, of a world in which appearances dictated consequence. Yet through these admissions he conveyed choice, a willingness to act, to intervene, to shield not from scandal alone but from injustice. His transparency, measured and deliberate, created a space in which she could breathe, think, and weigh the possibilities of trust. The act of confession became mutual, a turning point that recognized them as participants in the same delicate narrative. By the time the evening waned toward midnight, the library's fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across their faces. The rain softened, pattering less insistently against the windows. She rose, folding her hands once more, steady yet transformed by the conversation. The Duke offered a bow, slight but full of intent, a gesture acknowledging the weight of both their disclosures. "You will not be alone in the days to come," he said, voice low and unwavering. "And neither shall your courage be unrecognized." She accepted the assurance without protest, understanding that the moment had shifted the balance between them irrevocably. Protection had become engagement, recognition had become connection. Outside, the city slept under the cleansing rain, oblivious to the intimate transformations within these walls. Inside, the room held the quiet resonance of confession and commitment, unspoken yet undeniable. She knew that what began with whispered gossip and public scrutiny had now moved into a private realm, a space in which the central conflict, society's cruelty versus personal honor, would be addressed not by rumor but by deliberate action. As she stepped toward the door, he remained a moment longer, eyes following her with restrained intensity. The turn of the key, the echo of her footfalls on polished floor, marked the end of this evening but not the story itself. It had reached a pivot, a turning point where trust, courage, and latent affection intertwined, and where both realized that future trials would be faced together, bound by conscience and the fragile beginnings of desire. The chapter concluded, yet the narrative pressed onward, promising revelations, challenges, and the slow bloom of a connection neither had anticipated but both would come to treasure. The morning light filtered through tall, arched windows, gilding the ballroom with a warmth that made every crystal chandelier shimmer as if aware of the moment's significance. The assembly had gathered in hushed anticipation, their whispers now tempered by curiosity rather than scorn. The young lady entered with a measured composure, her gown a soft blend of cream and sage, its subtle elegance speaking of refinement without ostentation. Every eye followed her, some with admiration, some with lingering doubt, but none dared to voice judgment aloud. She was no longer the girl abandoned to rumor, she was the woman whose dignity had weathered storms unseen and whose courage had earned its due. The Duke, standing at the dais with the gravity of his title evident in posture and bearing, observed her arrival with a quiet intensity. His dark coat, immaculately tailored, bore the weight of authority yet seemed softened by the promise he had long withheld from the public eye. When their gazes met, it was neither accidental nor fleeting. It was a silent acknowledgment of trials endured, of private confessions shared, and of decisions made in favor of conscience and integrity. He extended a hand, not as an imperative but as a gesture of partnership, a subtle claim that the world outside could neither deny nor distort. The murmurs of the crowd shifted as he stepped forward. Every gentleman, every matron, every whispering observer sensed that this was a turning point. Where scandal had once threatened her, it now hovered at the edges, powerless against the quiet authority he wielded with precision. He raised his voice not loud but clear enough to command attention without arrogance. In this assembly, I affirm that the lady before you has been unjustly subjected to judgment and rumor. Her honor, her courage, and her station demand recognition, and it shall be so. The words reverberated, not as accusation of those present, but as a declaration of truth that required no defense from her. She felt a warmth blossom, restrained yet undeniable, as those words shielded her once more. It was not protection in the abstract, it was validation, acknowledgement of every hardship endured in silence. The room's attention, once a weight pressing against her shoulders, now became a witness to justice. Eyes that had sought to question her intentions now regarded her with respect, curiosity tempered by the inevitability of the Duke's claim. She breathed with a freedom that had been denied for months, the tension in her spine easing even as the moment's gravity persisted. He continued, and the cadence of his voice shifted subtly from public pronouncement to private assertion, though still audible enough for those near to perceive its import. I have observed more than propriety demands, and I have acted not for spectacle but for truth. Her merit, her resilience, and her dignity compel my regard, and in matters of the heart, I will not deny what conscience recognizes as just. Each word carried the weight of intention, careful yet unflinching, marking the boundary between society's expectation and personal choice. She understood fully the meaning, love declared not in fleeting passion, but in deliberate courage, visible and irreproachable. A hush settled, and then a subtle rustle as he offered her his arm, this time formally and without need for explanation. She accepted, her fingers brushing against his in a contact both fleeting and profound. The assembly watched, silent witnesses to a union sanctioned not merely by ceremony, but by the trials that had preceded it. It was the culmination of whispered protection, private confessions, and steadfast vigilance, the resolution of tension woven through months of social scrutiny and emotional restraint. The rumors that had dogged her faded in the wake of his declaration. No whisper could contest the authority of a man whose voice carried not only rank but conscience. Relatives who had questioned her claim to inheritance were compelled to acknowledge the truth publicly. Adversaries who had delighted in her isolation were rendered powerless by the weight of evidence and the unmistakable endorsement of one whose judgment could not be ignored. Society, as it often does, reshaped itself around the inevitability of recognition, and she stepped forward no longer at the mercy of rumor, but as a participant in her own story. The Duke guided her to the center of the room, a deliberate act that placed her where she belonged, visible yet dignified. Their conversation, though limited by formalities, carried the subtext of mutual understanding and quiet affection. She sensed the careful balance of his demeanor, every word measured, every movement restrained, yet each imbued with subtle warmth and unspoken devotion. It was a language of glances, slight inclinations of the head, and the weight of presence, speaking volumes that society might never articulate but could not ignore. He spoke again, softly, in a tone intended for her ears yet audible to those close enough to perceive. The world has judged hastily, but I have chosen otherwise. Your courage and honor merit not only recognition but partnership. I claim it openly, and it shall not be withdrawn. There was no flourish, no theatricality, the words were simple, deliberate, and undeniable. She understood that in his measure, this declaration was as binding as any legal contract, as formidable as any societal edict, and infinitely more personal. Her reply was equally measured, a reflection of the composure she had cultivated through months of trials. I accept your protection, your regard, and the trust you extend, not as favor, but as acknowledgement of what is due. Her voice, clear yet soft, resonated with the authority of someone who had endured adversity with dignity. In that exchange, the central conflict, between society's judgment and personal integrity, between rumor and truth, found its resolution. Their connection, forged through observation, intervention, and confession, reached its natural fruition in mutual recognition and commitment. As the assembly continued, the couple moved through the room together, their steps synchronized, their gestures subtle yet unmistakable. Faces that had once scrutinized now watched in admiration or acquiescence. The young lady's gaze met his repeatedly, each glance a conversation in itself, acknowledgement of trials overcome, gratitude for steadfastness, and the tender bloom of affection fully realized. The tension that had once defined every interaction dissolved into a composed certainty, tempered by experience and secured by mutual respect. By evening's close, the couple exited the ballroom under the pale glow of gas lamps, London streets glistening from earlier rain. Carriages waited, attendants prepared, and yet the world seemed momentarily paused to honor the union that had been wrought not through whim or convenience, but through integrity, courage, and deliberate choice. As they entered their carriage together, hands briefly touching, hearts aligned yet disciplined by habit and etiquette, it was clear that the season of trials had yielded its reward. In the quiet of that shared space they spoke little, for words were unnecessary. Their mutual understanding, shaped by challenge and revelation, sufficed. The city sped past, blurred into motion, while inside the carriage the promise of partnership, affection, and enduring respect filled the air. They had confronted rumor, societal expectation, and personal vulnerability, and emerged not merely unscathed, but victorious in the terms that mattered most. Thus concluded the chapter of confrontation and resolution, yet it left a horizon rich with possibility. The young lady, once exposed and vulnerable, now walked alongside a man whose conscience and courage had intersected with her own fortitude. The Duke, equally tempered by duty and newly permitted affection, recognized in her resilience a reflection of his own principles. Together they stepped into a future defined not by the whispers of society, but by deliberate choice, honor, and the shared promise of a life where dignity and love could coexist unchallenged. Their story, having reached a climactic fulfillment, promised continuity, growth, and the quiet triumph of connection that had long been denied them both.